I have the great honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Amy Baker, who I came across Dr. Baker's experience and credentials and training in a document that she worked on in a case in which I was also involved in. I can tell you we're very fortunate to have her here with us. Her original research on adult children of parental alienation syndrome really is groundbreaking, and therefore I'm going to sort of get out of the way and let her start talking, but it's a great honor to have you here. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming here tonight to hear me talk. I'm pleased to be here. I'm going to learn how to do this. Okay. You know, they say you're supposed to start with a joke, and this is the only humor tonight. You know, this is the saddest topic, and that's partly, I think, why I'm always drawn to wearing black when I give these talks. There's just so much suffering here. But here's a little bit of humor. You can see the guy on the right looks pretty despondent. He's got some Band-Aids. He's been beaten up. He looks pretty demoralized. Life's really taken a bad turn. Okay, this is from the New Yorker. And I won't ask you to guess what the caption is. I'll just tell you if I can get this to work. Since we don't have children, my ex turned the cats against me. So I know. Oh, okay. And I love this. He totally nails it, right? It's not really about the kids. If there's no kids, it's the dogs. If there's no dogs, it's the cats. It's sort of whatever. Because people who do this, and they're going to do it till they're done doing it. All right. All right, so I have to start with some definitions, and I know you all know all of this, but this is just my talk, and I always start with it. So I like to make the distinction between parental alienation on the one hand, which is a set of strategies that a parent uses to try to turn the child against the other parent. Parental alienation syndrome is the resulting response in the child. And it's important to make this distinction because not every child who's exposed to parental alienation strategies does succumb to the pressure and does reject that other parent. So we need to have a language for talking about the effort on the one hand of the parent who's trying to turn the child against the other parent, and then the child's response when that child comes to believe that that other parent is completely unworthy of having a relationship with. Boy, I'm having a hard time with this. Okay. I also, these are the terms that I use. The alienating parent is the parent who's exhibiting parental alienation. They get the ing, alienating. They're the active parents. They're doing something. The other parent I call the targeted parent. I don't refer to them as the rejected parent because I am in some respects an optimist. I want to talk about this before that parent is rejected. They're the targeted parent. Before it's too late, before that kid totally rejects that parent, we still need language for talking about who that parent is. And I think of them as the targeted parent because I think of that alienating parent sort of with a rifle and they're looking through the crosshairs and they're targeting that parent. It's a very active thing that that alienating parent is doing. So those are my definitions, all right? I want to give you a deep clinical picture of the 8 behavioral manifestations of the parental alienation syndrome as defined originally by Richard Gardner. He's the genius, in my opinion, who saw kids who were rejecting or having negative feelings towards one parent and identified 8 behaviors that seem to go together. That's what a syndrome is. It's 8. In this case, it's 8, but a syndrome is a collection of symptoms with a common etiology or common cause. He's the one that identified these are the 8 things that when they go together, it's most likely the child is rejecting a parent due to parental alienation as opposed to rejecting a parent for other reasons. So we need to know, what does an alienated child look like? Because from a clinical point of view or from a judge's point of view, you might have a child in your office saying, I hate, let's say it's mom. I hate mom. I want nothing to do with her. How do you know whether that child is rejecting mom in this case because the other parent is engineering that rejection, or because mom's a crummy mom and this kid just doesn't want anything to do with her? So we need to know, what are the 8 behavioral manifestations of PAS? Okay, so I'm going to go through this, and I want to give you like I said, a pretty deep clinical picture. I'm not just going to run through the 8. I'm going to give you lots of examples, so when you're done, you're going to know, that's what an alienated child looks like. And the point of this is ultimately to come to a place where we could make a differential diagnosis. We have a kid who doesn't want anything to do with the parent, and we can say, this is because of PAS, or this is for some other reason, because not every child who rejects a parent is rejecting a parent due to parental alienation. The quotes and the vignettes and the stories I'm going to give you that go along with these 8 behavioral manifestations come from my research with targeted parents, where I got them to tell me vignettes and stories about their relationship with their child and their child's behavior. Okay, so the first behavioral manifestation is the campaign of denigration, and I just sort of boiled that down to everything mom does is stupid and I never loved her. And I want you to notice that I'm going to go back and forth between referring to the alienating parent and the targeted parent. Sometimes it's mom and dad, and sometimes it's dad and mom. In other words, in my research, I certainly found that mothers can be alienating parents and dads can be targeted parents, and the reverse is also true. Dads can be alienating parents and moms can be targeted parents. Okay, so what is this campaign of denigration? Well, the child becomes obsessed with hatred of the targeted parent. So it's not just, I don't really feel close to that parent anymore. Parents who were once loved and valued seemingly overnight become hated and feared. This often happens so quickly that the targeted parent cannot believe what happened to their child. Their loving child turns into this hateful, spiteful person who refuses to so much as share a meal. It is a total blanket condemnation of that parent. And as you notice in my quote there, I never loved her. So they wipe out the entire history of that relationship to such an extent that if you showed an alienated child a photograph of them with the supposed hated parent, with that targeted parent, and you could show them a video or a photograph with that child snuggling with that parent, playing on the beach, snuggling, watching a movie, having a good time, going to Disney World, whatever, you show them that picture, you say, well, you're telling me you never had a good time, you never felt close, but look, you look sort of close in that picture, or you're smiling, it looks like you're having fun. And what does that child say? I was just pretending. I wasn't really having fun. Dad said he would spank me if I didn't smile. So they just completely rewrite history. They can't admit that they ever had any good feelings for that parent. And of course, it's important to note that if there's a legitimate reason for the child's rejection of the targeted parent, like abuse or neglect, then the child's fear and hostility is legitimate, and it's not parental alienation. And this is, I'm going to sort of bring this up a few times because this is where Richard Gardner sort of gets into hot water because people misunderstand and think that he's saying if a child rejects an abusive parent, that's parental alienation. And he never said that, and he's very clear, if there's bona fide abuse or neglect, it can't be parental alienation. All right? So I surveyed some targeted parents, and I said, tell me about this campaign of denigration. Give me an example from your life. And one mother wrote to me, I ran for the local school board, and my son wrote a letter to my opponent telling him what a bad person I was. I mean, can you imagine a child actually caring that their parent's running for the school board and then taking the effort to find out who the opponent is and then bothering to write a letter? I mean, it's like so far above and beyond normal child behavior, right? Another mother wrote to me, quote, my daughter said, whatever it takes, I'm going to destroy you so I can live with Dad. All right, so this is like in a very over-the-top kind of attitude that the child has. Here's another mother wrote to me, they tell me that I'm stupid, that I'm a liar, and that I've put their father in jail or will put him in jail. And I love that quote because there's no allegiance to reality, right? It's like, well, maybe you're thinking you're going to do something bad, so I hate you and you're out of my life forever, right? The mother in this case didn't even do it, and the kids are already mad at her thinking she might do it. So these and many similar statements portray children who are verbally abusive, entitled, angry, and hostilely rejecting toward the targeted parent. All right, and that's just the first manifestation. Okay, so here's just a letter just to sort of hammer it home. This is an 8-year-old girl who wouldn't go into the therapy room with her dad, and the therapist said, well, tell me why. Why won't you even step into the room with your father? And she wrote 1, I hate Kevin, 2, I hate Kevin, 3, I hate Kevin, 4, I hate Kevin. So it's just this absolute, utter hatred towards this parent. Who, and you notice she doesn't call him dad, right? Okay, so the second manifestation is weak, frivolous, and absurd reasons for the campaign. And you could sort of sum that up as, Dad slurps his soup and made us go to Disney World. What a terrible dad, right? So these kids, when you ask them, you know, you used to live with Dad and you used to spend X amount of time with him. Now you won't even have dinner with him once a week. Or you won't even see your mother once a month, or Mother's Day. You won't even go out for lunch. Why? And the answers they give are weak, frivolous, and absurd. They're not the kind of explanations that make sense for why a child would want nothing to do with that parent. Okay, so here are some quotes from parents. This parent wrote to me, I think this is a mom. He said that he doesn't like the orange stripes in my hair, and the way I dress is embarrassing. He couldn't believe I wore cowboy boots with my skirt to pick him up from school. I mean, again, can you imagine a child actually caring that the mother's wearing cowboy boots? I mean, it's like so patently absurd. Okay, here's a dad. I said, tell me about the reasons. Why does your son say he won't see you anymore? Quote, you make me eat bad food and you never put me down for my nap on the couch. I say we call DIFUS right away on that one, right? So again, this is just not the level of explanation that makes sense. All right? Manifestation 3, lack of ambivalence about the alienating parent. Now, it's a truism of development that kids have ambivalence, mixed feelings, about everybody in their life, including their parents. Even the best parent in the universe disappoints or frustrates their child, because children are incredibly unreasonable, right? You can't possibly satisfy every desire of your child. So even the best parent is going to annoy or frustrate or disappoint their child. So it's normal for children, even with parents that they love and adore, to be angry at them, to be frustrated with them, to be hurt, all right? But if you talk to an alienated child, they talk about the alienating parent as if that parent is absolutely perfect and above reproach. It's an abnormal lack of ambivalence. And the example I have here is a real-life example. I love my father to death. It's not normal, right? That's just not how kids normally feel about their parents, even really good parents. And if you ask an alienated child, tell me one bad thing about Dad, in this case, one thing. He must do something you don't like, one little smidge of a thing. And they're like, nope, can't think of anything. And then the reverse is true. If one parent is all good, the other one is all bad. So nothing good. They can't think of anything good about that other parent. Nothing. They're a bad cook, they're a bad house cleaner, they're bad this, they're bad that, they're bad at everything. So that's manifestation 3. I'm going to skip the quotes because we started a little late and I don't want to belabor that. Okay, manifestation 4, the independent thinker phenomenon. And notice this is in quotes, big quotation marks, all right? This is where the child will profess and go overboard to make the point that they are not being influenced by the other parent. So these kids will say, Mom, Dad had nothing to do with this, but I don't want to see you anymore. So they know in advance that you're going to say that the other parent had something to do with it. And these kids often use the phrase free will. I have free will. Right? I'm doing, this is all my thinking, when clearly it looks like it's coming from somewhere else. Okay, so I'm just going to give you one example. This is a quote. My daughter will frequently say things that she tells me are her idea, and she will say she has free will. She tells me that when she doesn't call me, that it's her fault and not her father's. So again, they're just sort of going out of their way. And I'm not going to read this letter at length, but I asked a parent to send me an example of the independent thinker phenomenon. And here it is. There's the phrase free will in there. This is an 8-year-old girl saying, I have free will. I'm writing this letter on my own. You're ruining my life because you won't let me travel to Europe. Okay, so it's all right. Let's go to the next one. Manifestation 5, absence of guilt about the treatment of the targeted parent. So if there are any targeted parents out here, you know that the alienating parent basically gives the child permission to break your heart and to treat you very badly. These kids treat the targeted parent cruelly, harshly, with no love and affection and no good feeling. And these kids appear, and I say appear because in my research with the adults who lived through this long enough to talk about it and tell me they did suffer guilt later when they realized what they had done. But as children, they appear to have no guilt. They will say, oh, well, I took that $200 gift from Mom, but I didn't have to say thank you. She only did it to look good for the judge. So they just find ways of not really acknowledging the humanity, the normal human courtesy that you would want to give another person, let alone your parent. All right, that's a hallmark of alienated kids. Manifestation 6, reflexive support, automatic support. So, you know, even when there's a court order and the divorce is signed, sealed, and delivered, there's about a million ways that alienating parents and targeted parents can disagree and argue over things, right? There's all this gray area in court orders. There's all this wiggle room. There's just lots of opportunity still to have disagreements. And in every case, the child will side with the alienating parent, no matter how absurd that parent's claim is. The child will automatically, reflexively support that parent. And the example that I give is I've just heard over and over again, the kids will go spend time with the alienating parent, come back to the targeted parent and say, you stole my college money. I've heard like 3-year-olds saying that. They don't even know what college is or money is. And they're like, how dare you steal my college money? And I'll say to the targeted parents, because usually at this point in the talk, some of them are nodding their heads, yeah, gee, that happened to me. And I say, so what do? You go upstairs and you get the bank statement, right? And the targeted parents are nodding their head, yeah, of course, if I'm accused of stealing my kid's money, I want to show them I didn't steal it. And I say, and so let me guess, you took the paper out and you waved it in front of your kid, and did they look at it or did their eyes sort of glaze over? Right. They don't want to see the documentation that that they're wrong. They're like completely wed to this idea that everything the alienating parent says is right and everything the targeted parent says is wrong, no matter how patently absurd the alienating parent is. Okay. Manifestation 7, presence of borrowed scenarios. So alienated children often make accusations toward the targeted parent that utilize phrases and ideas adopted wholesale from the alienating parent. And one clue that a scenario is borrowed is the child's use of language and ideas that he or she clearly doesn't understand. And Gardner gives the classic example of the child saying, Daddy touched my vagina. I don't know what that is, but I know it's bad. And I can tell you from my own research, one of the people that I interviewed had a phone. The mom dialed the phone and put it up to the kid, and he just repeated. The mother was whispering in his ears, and he said, I never want to see my father again. He's a womanizer. He was 9. I said, did you know what womanizer was? He said, no. He had no idea. So, and another person I interviewed, the mom literally wrote out a script for her, like a little play, a little monologue. And when the dad would come to visit, because the mom didn't let the dad take the child out of the house, so all contact had to be under her eye. And before the visit, the mom would rehearse with the daughter the little play, and then the dad would come visit, and the girl would read the script with all these borrowed scenarios in it, and it always ended with, you're a horrible father and I hate you, and then she'd run out of the room screaming and crying. And of course the dad didn't know. To him, his kid was upset with him. But in fact, she was just going through these, this borrowed scenario, this script. And this is what gives alienated kids the feeling of being brainwashed or programmed, and that's why, you know, they have this sort of like automaton quality where they're just repeating, you know, what they're supposed to be saying. Okay. And the final manifestation is rejection of the targeted parent extends to his or her entire friends and family. It's like they have cooties or something, right? So formerly beloved aunts and uncles and grandparents and cousins, people that this child had a loving, close relationship with for years, are all of a sudden, you know, cut off. That's it. They're out. And these kids will miss once in a lifetime anniversaries, weddings, funerals. They, you know, cold-heartedly, completely cut off that side of the family. And that's, you know, the tribal warfare aspect of this, where it's like the families are seen as two warring camps, and the kid won't have anything to do with that other camp. Okay, so those are the 8 behavioral manifestations as identified by Richard Gardner and supported in some of my research. And so I just want to go back to that concept of the differential diagnosis. I'm going to go to the next one. Okay. So one way to think about this is, well, how do we know if a kid who's exhibiting rejection of a parent isn't just rejecting that parent because that parent's abusive, right? We need to know this from a clinical point of view. Judges need to know they don't want to send a kid to an abusive parent, right? They see a kid who says, I hate that parent and I never want to see that parent again. Well, how do we know that we should protect the child from that parent, or we should work towards a reconciliation? Well, the truth is, I think people make this more complicated than it needs to be. Because kids who have been abused by a parent do not exhibit those 8 behavioral manifestations. They do not reject the abusive parent. Kids who have been burned, beaten, molested, the worst things a parent can do to a child, those kids want one thing. They want to go back to that parent. It was mommy's fault. No, they say, it wasn't mommy's fault. I was bad. That's why mommy hit me. Right? That's the classic abuse scenario of a child who's been abused. They don't say, I never want to see that abusive parent again. That's just not how abused kids behave. They blame themselves. And they do not proudly and widely discuss the abuse. Think back to that kid who wrote the letter to the mom's opponent running for the school board. Kids who have been abused do not do that. It's like a breakthrough, a miracle when you're doing therapy with an abused kid, when you finally can get them to admit the details of the abuse. All right, they don't, you know, take out newspaper ads and, you know, announce to everybody, you know, my parent's a horrible parent, all right? And they don't lack ambivalence. Kids who've been abused will say, well, mommy loses her temper sometimes, or daddy loses his temper and daddy might drink, but he's really good at this and he's really good at that and he really tries hard. They don't have that absolute black and white. Even if they see the abuse and even if they're willing to admit it, they don't wipe out everything good about that parent. And they don't worship the other parent. All right? And they don't reject the extended family of the abusive parent. The primary foster care mode at this point, at least in the United States, is known as kinship care, where kids who have been abused are placed with the relatives of the abuser. Right? That's like 40% at this point of kids in foster care are placed with kinship care. And those kids aren't resisting, you know, and ignoring and wiping out that entire family. Right, so it's 2 totally different clinical pictures between a child who's really been abused and a child who's been manipulated to reject one parent by the other parent. I want to talk for a little bit about some of the criticisms of the concept of PAS, and I feel obligated to do this because I don't want to give a talk and then people go back to their computers and they Google PAS and they find out that Richard Gardner was a pedophile devil, and without Amy Baker, boy, she doesn't know anything. So I'm going to try to take the devil by the horns, or whatever that phrase is, and do some of this. Okay, so the first one is, well, PAS isn't a valid syndrome because it's not in the DSM. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. Clearly, if the APA doesn't think it exists, it's junk science and it couldn't possibly be real. All right, so Why is that not a valid criticism? Because it sounds good, right? If you didn't know anything about the DSM and how it's made, you'd think, yeah, that PAS doesn't exist. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about how the DSM is created. First of all, it is revised about every 15 years. Unlike, say, the American Heart Association's guidelines for treatment, which is updated like every time there's a breakthrough, this is created every 15 or 20 years. So there's a huge gap in the updating it. It does not necessarily represent the current wisdom. The last time it was updated was, I think, 97. All right, so this is a quote from Alan Francis. He became the chair of the revision for version 4, which is right now the current version. He was critiquing the chair, Bob Spitzer, who undertook the revision from 2 to 3. So Alan Francis is describing, how did a new diagnosis get in from 2 to 3? How did Bob do it? And Alan Francis said Bob Spitzer never met a diagnosis he didn't like. And he actually tells the story of Bob being in the elevator and sort of whipping up some new diagnosis and making notes, and then it got into the DSM. So Alan says that there were a bunch of people sitting around the room, and it would usually be some combination of the accepted wisdom of the group as interpreted by Bob, with a little added weight to the people he respected most, and a little bit to whoever got the last word in. All right, so I don't want you to walk away thinking, well, if it's not in the DSM, it couldn't possibly be valid, because there's a lot of politics, a lot of finagling behind the scenes about what gets into the DSM. I'm sure you all know homosexuality used to be in, and then it's not in anymore. And it's not because there was some breakthrough in science. It's because homosexual psychiatrists stood up at a meeting and said, you're insulting us and you better take it out. And that is the truth, all right? It's not that there was a breakthrough in science. All right, so I'm going to just go on a little bit more. So Alan Francis, who took over from 2 to 3, said, you know, since Bob never saw a diagnosis he didn't like, and I think he played a little fast and loose with letting all these diagnoses in, I'm going to clamp down. In order to get in this time, it can't be a diagnosis that's subject to controversy or could possibly be misused. So anything that was a little out, all right? Different standards. Okay, and just to nail it home, in version 2, which was created in 1968, there were 182 diagnoses. Version 3 came out in 1980, 265. Look at that huge leap. 3R, they put a couple more in. And then when PAS was up for discussion, which was in version 4, only 5 new diagnoses got in. All right, so PAS didn't stand a chance. All right, and to be fair, back in 1992, when they task forces closed the books, 2 years before 1994, when version 4 came out. In 1992, that's when they stopped reviewing the evidence for new diagnoses. It is true that the empirical evidence for PAS wasn't as strong as it is today. And so for all of those reasons, it was a perfect storm for it not getting into the DSM. And now 100 years from now, I'm not going to be standing here, but somebody could be standing here. This wouldn't be a valid argument. But right now, it does make sense to not believe the myth that PAS isn't valid because it's not in the DSM. I don't know if that was too many double negatives, but you're following me, right? All right. Here's the second one. Well, kids know who's the better parent. We should just let them choose. They know which parent's going to take them to soccer practice and which one's going to make them do homework and which one's going to make them knuckle down and be the best kid, right? Kids always make good choices, right? Okay. But this would make the judge's life a lot easier, right? Let's just call the kid into the judge's chamber and say, kid, who do you want to be with? You got it, right? So there is this myth that kids pick the better parent. All right, and when I tell you later tonight about some of my findings of the adult children, it will hammer this home. But needless to say, children make all sorts of bad decisions, and even adults can be manipulated to make a bad decision, right? If people couldn't be manipulated, I don't think the advertisers would spend all their money trying to get us to drink Coke versus Pepsi, right? It must work. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that children never make a good decision. It just means that some kids who say they hate one parent and want nothing to do with that parent aren't making the right decision. We can't believe that. Okay, oops, I need to go back. Okay, so this one's a little more complicated. I'm sure you all know that the radical feminist movement does not believe that PAS is valid. They're quite adamant that it's harmful to women, that abusive, battering men make false allegations of parental alienation, accuse women who are trying to protect their children of parental alienation, and that these victim moms will lose custody because they've been falsely accused of parental alienation, and that in fact Gardner created the concept of parental alienation to do just that. He was an evil master genius who wanted to take custody away from women and support pedophile, abusive men. All right, now I don't believe that's true, and I can talk about that in a minute, but it is quite possible that some men make false allegations of parental alienation in order to get custody away from victim abused women, right? Because anything is possible in this universe, and I'm sure that does either could happen, might happen, has happened. But obviously, just logically speaking, that doesn't mean that PAS doesn't also exist. We know that false allegations of sexual abuse exist, but nobody would say, therefore, no child has ever been sexually abused, right? That's just not logically, it's not necessary logically to conclude that sexual abuse doesn't exist because people can make false allegations. So therefore, we don't need to throw out the concept of PAS simply because it could be misused, all right? By the way, I've never met a woman who's lost custody because she's been falsely accused. It could happen, but I haven't actually heard of those cases yet where it's played all the way out and the woman has lost custody. Okay, then when people get desperate, they just attack Gardner personally. All right, I don't know if you've seen the website where they actually paint devil horns and a tail on him. No, I'm serious. He's like really a vilified person. He's been called a pedophile. He self-publishes. He didn't really work at Columbia University. He was a hired gun. I mean, they're just sort of slinging a lot of mud at him. And when you take each of these allegations seriously and you look at them, you realize there's like a germ of truth perhaps, but certainly not the whole truth. I mean, he did self-publish a few books, but he also published numerous books with the top publishing companies in this country. I'm sure you know his long bibliography. So one or I think two books were self-published out of maybe 30. So it's sort of true, but it certainly isn't the whole truth. He was really at Columbia University. He had to get tenure. He did all the things that need to be done. You know, the one about him being a pedophile is a little complicated. I don't know if you've seen his website that takes these quotes very much out of context, sort of plucks things that sound a little egregious or weird, and then just lists them all. And the accumulated weight, you sort of go, this guy may be, I'm not so sure. But then you go back and you read his book and you see they all make sense in the context of what he was writing. For example, he says, quote, "Children are polymorphous perverse." Okay, that sounds a little something, right? A little off or something. And then you read it and you realize, of course, that's something Freud said. He didn't make that up. And what he's talking about is normal human sexual development, that children are able to derive pleasure, sensual pleasure, just touching their own bodies, that they don't make the distinction between male and female or object and person or adult and child. It doesn't follow, and Gardner certainly does not say, and therefore it would be okay to molest a child. In fact, Gardner is very clear, sexual molestation is robbing the child and exploiting the child and a terrible, terrible thing. But if you just see the thing, children are polymorphous perverse, the people who want to malign Gardner then say, see, he says sexual abuse is okay. All right, I don't mean to belabor this, but you'd think he's like my relative. He's not. I just feel like he deserves a fair hearing here. All right, then there's a few websites that say, well, we all know that PAS has been uniformly discredited. It's junk science. Everybody knows it. And then again, you go and you actually look, and there's like 2 or 3 articles that haven't really been published in peer-reviewed journals that reference each other that don't really marshal actual evidence saying that PAS isn't valid. They just sort of keep restating everybody knows it's been discredited, as if saying it enough makes it true. And that's not really, that's just simply not true. And the accumulated clinical observations, clinical wisdom, and research, in my opinion, supports the validity of PAS. All right. Hey, applause. All right. All right, but I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. All right, so let's talk about my study a little bit. Okay, so part of what I did want to do was try to establish some validity for the concept of PAS, and so I decided to do some research in this area, and I very quickly figured out what I would consider the burning question in the hearts and minds of targeted parents everywhere. Will I ever get my child back? All right. And I can tell you that when I put out the word on the internet that I was doing research on this topic, I was flooded by desperate targeted parents who wanted to know the answer to that question. And then they wanted to know, well, if some kids do grow up and figure this out, what's the catalyst or the trigger? I mean, can we like speed this along already so I can get my kid back sooner? And then targeted parents also want to know, well, if my kid's been manipulated to reject me, what is this doing to his or her psyche? What does this do to my child's development to have been an alienated child? All right, so those are the 3 questions that guided my research. And in order to do my study, the only way that I could do it was to interview adults who believed that when they were children, they had been manipulated by one parent to reject the other parent. I mean, the alternative would be to find alienated kids and then wait 20 years and spend $1 million and then interview them. But you know, researchers are impatient. We want to know the answer. So I started with the adults and interviewed them to talk about their childhood. Okay, so I just told you I did in-depth interviews. I'll just tell you a little bit about how I found these people. You know, I thought it would be hard. In fact, I thought, well, what if nobody responds to my call? I put out a call on the internet when you were a child where you turned against one parent by the other parent. I didn't use the phrase adult children of parental whatever, because it turned out to be true that they didn't know the term parental alienation syndrome, but turned against one parent by the other parent sort of boiled it down. And I very quickly found people. Yes? I'd have a hard time finding those people, because how would I find them? When you were a child and one of your parents, but you don't believe they, it'd be sort of hard. Not impossible, because the people I interviewed had siblings who hadn't had the realization, and I could do a study on them, but I didn't. So yeah, I only interviewed people who had a realization, who said, gee, everything I thought was true isn't true, and so I could ask them, well, how did you have that realization, and what has this done to you? All right, so I was telling you, I found 40 people. So before I even analyzed my data, I actually had a finding. I mean, that's the best kind of research in the world, right? The answer is yes, some of these kids grow up to figure it out. And I know that because they said to me, yes, when I was a child, I was manipulated and I hated one of my parents, and now I don't. I've realized that was a mistake. And so that's like the good news of my research. Some of these kids figure it out. We don't know what proportion. I couldn't tell you if there's 1,000 kids, what proportion of them are going to figure it out. I can't tell you if your kids are going to figure it out. But I can tell you what, in general, what I found for my research are the catalysts to figuring it out. Did somebody have a question over there?
Is there a mean age group?
They were 18 to 67. They had to be legal adults. And you know, my favorite story, again, I thought it would be hard to find people, so I made these flyers, and I gave one to a therapist I know. She was going to a conference, and I thought, oh, well, maybe some of her therapist friends who were going to this conference will have some clients, or they can put it in their waiting room, this flyer. And the man sitting next to this therapist on the airplane looks over, you know, right, who doesn't look at the stuff on the lap of the person sitting next to you, and he's looking over and he says, oh, that was my life. I had that experience, that was me. And she gave him the flyer, and he called me, and he became a subject in my research. It was not hard to find people, so I consider that very good news. Okay, but there's some bad news too. All right. Okay, so my first finding, and I already sort of gave this away earlier, is that fathers can be alienating parents. Of the people I interviewed, I think 1/4 of them had alienating fathers, and I didn't go about trying to make it even between fathers and mothers. I took the first 40 people I interviewed, and that's just the way that it played out. I imagine the gender breakdown might be different now. The people I interviewed, some of them were much older, and so just, you know, the whole dynamics of custody were different 10, 20, 30 years ago than they are now. But for whatever reason, this is how it broke down. But it's very important that therapists get this message, that fathers can be alienating parents, because I know some mothers have like the added burden, you know, of being a mother who's lost her child, and then to walk into a therapist's office and say, you know, I think my ex-husband's doing this thing, and then the therapist says, oh no, it can't be parental alienation. That's a thing that mothers do, because that's the prototype. That's how Gardner unfortunately wrote about it, because that's what he was seeing in 1985 when he was writing about it. But I think we can put that issue to rest. And you know, twice now I've done research with Doug Darnall. We put a message up on his website because it attracts a lot of traffic. And we wrote simply, are you worried that the other parent of your child is trying to turn your child against you? These are for 2 studies that Doug and I did together. And within a week, we got 100 responses each time. And it was 50-50 mothers and fathers. Now, that doesn't mean it's 50-50 in the population. Mothers might be more willing to read the internet and participate, blah, blah, blah. But the point is, fathers do it, mothers do it. We should know that. Even non-custodial parents can do it. Some of the people in my study, the kid would go visit the other parent, you know, every other weekend. And that kid could still get alienated. All it takes is effective use of alienation strategies and the desire to do it. You need that combination and some access to the child. If you never, ever, ever, ever get to see your child, I don't think you could alienate that child. I mean, and no phone calls, no nothing. But as long as you have access, motivation, and skillful use of these strategies, you're going to be able to do it. And I also found, and this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, this happens in intact families. Either before the divorce is initiated, the parental alienation can be going on, and even parental alienation syndrome. Some people leave a marriage because they go, oh my God, my spouse is undermining me and they're turning my kids again, I got to get out of this. Or they stay in the marriage because they think if I leave, it'll be even worse because then my kid's going to be with that other person and I'm never going to see them. So it's not the sole purview of bitter ex-wives who have custody, all right? Every time. Okay. So this is another finding. The alienation was not fully internalized, at least for the people that I interviewed. I said to one of them, all right, so you told your dad, drop dead, go away, I hate you, you're disgusting, you're horrible, I never, ever, ever, ever want to see you again. What were you feeling in your heart? Well, I didn't really think my father would go away forever. I still sort of liked him. So, you know, there's levels of consciousness. So this is important for the targeted parent who only sees the hatred and the alienation message from the child. Go away, you're garbage, I don't need you, I never needed a father, I don't need a mother, I have this other parent. The targeted parent takes this very personally, right? Nothing can hurt you like the rejection of your child. So my message is, you know, and I'm going to get to this later with my advice section, you know, Don't take it personally, and know that it's somewhere inside your child, that child still wants a relationship with you. They're just doing what they need to do. They're following that script, but inside somewhere is a child who still loves you. Okay, another finding, another thing I want to talk about. There's a lot of loss involved with PAS. You know, there's the obvious loss. A parent loses a child, and that's, you know, short of the death of a child, this is the worst thing that can happen to a parent. You know, these parents live in a constant state of yearning, a constant state of disappointment and pain and suffering. They don't get to go through the 7 stages of grieving that they finally come to acceptance, right? They live in sort of a suspended animation. And of course, the child loses a parent, and that is a terrible thing to do to a child, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And of course, the child loses relationships with the whole extended family, and all of those people lose relationships. You know, I get phone calls from aunts and uncles and grandparents. Their heart's broken too. You know, they've invested, they love this child, they've seen this baby grow, and all of a sudden, you know, this 7-year-old or 10-year-old is saying, you know, I can't even be bothered to come to your wedding or funeral or this event or that event. I mean, it's horrible. But there's another loss too. The child loses a piece of him or herself. Okay, and my new pithy thing is, to turn a child against a parent is to turn a child against himself. All right. The child who's alienated has to cut off all the good memories they have of the targeted parent, because they're in there. If there was, in fact, good memories, good snuggles and watching movies and cavorting on the beach and whatever, that has to be buried. Any doubt the child has about the intentions of the alienating parent, like, why is mom having such a hard time? That has to get denied too. Any way in which they are like the targeted parent, whether it's that they look like that parent or they have the same sensibility of that parent, they're grumpy in the morning, whatever it is, they have to cut off that piece of themselves. And you know, I was giving this talk, and at this point in the talk, somebody in the audience said, you know, I just realized just this minute I'm an adult child of parental alienation. And he told the story that he had an Irish mother who was the alienating parent and a Hispanic father who he was forbidden to have any contact with and any good feelings for. And he said, you know, my whole life I felt compelled to have plastic surgery to change my appearance so I don't look Hispanic. And I never realized that it's because I didn't want to look like my father. And one of the young woman that I interviewed, when her mother was mad at her, the mother, again, in this case was the alienating parent, said, oh, you have those big sticking out ears just like your father. And you know what this girl did when she was a young girl? She glued her ears to her head because she couldn't tolerate being like her father, because to be like her father meant to be hated by her mother. And then she'd have nobody. All right, so this is a terrible thing to do to a child. There's many, many, many levels of loss. And you know, in my research, one of the things that I found was that sometimes before there's the reconciliation with the targeted parent, there has to be a reunion with the self. The child has to get back in touch with the parts of him or herself that he's had to cut off. He has to be able to admit, gee, maybe I shouldn't have cut off that parent. Maybe that parent's not so bad. Maybe that was a mistake. Okay, if you're not depressed enough already. Okay, so this was a surprise to me. I hadn't really thought about it. Many of the people I interviewed were physically and sexually abused by the parent they allied with, not the parent they rejected. And they all felt that they had been emotionally abused. And I'm going to talk in more detail about emotional abuse a little bit later. All right, and just to tell you a story, one of the people I interviewed, this is a little bit of a twist. The mom actually died in childbirth, and the dad had 4 kids already and a job that required traveling. And so he asked his sister to take care of the baby while he went and finished his business so that he could then, get a different job and be able to take care of his family. And the aunt, who had herself called mommy to this little baby, who then grew up to call her aunt and uncle mommy and daddy, and they physically and sexually molested her. And she still had her father. He still would come to visit, but she wouldn't go live with him, even though he wanted her to. He got a different job, his life settled down, he wanted his daughter back. And I said, well, why did you stay with these people who were physically and sexually abusing you? She said, I didn't want to disappoint my mother, meaning her aunt. She couldn't tolerate this person being disappointed in her. That was more important, not disappointing, than protecting herself and having a relationship with her father. That's the power of this, the mind control here. Okay. All right, so in my research with the adult children, I identified what I now consider like the top 17 or 20, I have varying lists, of parental alienation strategies. And this sort of goes to the heart of, well, how does a parent do it? How does a physically and sexually molesting parent sort of trick this child into pledging allegiance to this parent rather than having a relationship with the other parent? How do they do it, right? How does the cult leader get the cult member to give up everything and join the cult? And in my research that I did with Doug, we surveyed close to 100 targeted parents, and we asked them, list everything that you think that other parent is doing to turn your child against you. And of course, we had like the longest list you can imagine, and we coded them into categories, and we came up with reliability, and we identified what we think are the top alienating behaviors. And not a big surprise, they really overlap almost 100% with the same strategies that the adults identified their alienating parent is using. Does that make sense? It's pretty much the same thing. There's one or two differences, and when I go through and describing them, I'll point out which ones the adult children, even though they had the whole realization and knew sort of the whole story, they still missed a few things that the targeted parent, who's an adult when they're going through it, can identify as a problem behavior. All right, so the first one is bad-mouthing. This is sort of the sine qua non of parental alienation. You can't do it without bad-mouthing. But no parent just does this, because alienating parents use a whole arsenal of strategies. But bad-mouthing is the essence. This involves speaking ill of the parent to the child or within the child's earshot, very cleverly talking on the phone or talking to a neighbor so the child can overhear it. And this refers to a consistent pattern of negativity that's not balanced by anything positive. Every aspect of the targeted parent's personality and characteristics is fair game and likely to be criticized and picked over for critique. A parent who's 10 minutes late is presented as not caring, right? A parent who cooks a mediocre dinner is described as incompetent and unloving and unable to nurture the child. A parent who drives 10 miles too fast is a reckless danger to the child's safety. Even characteristics which are not in and of themselves inherently negative, like being a mediocre cook or a slightly fast driver, are depicted as problematic and worthy of concern, if not outright contempt. So think about the orange stripes in the hair or the cowboy boots. There's nothing inherently wrong with wearing cowboy. I'm going to get a pair of cowboy boots, all right? Just so I can wear them and say, see, there's nothing wrong with it. But it's painted as something that's like totally egregious and horrible. So the strategy of bad-mouthing was discussed by almost, I think, all but one of the adult children when I asked them, how did dad do it? How did he turn you against mom? Or how did mom do it? And they listed everything they could think of. All but one mentioned bad-mouthing. They didn't say that word. They said constant, steady stream of negativity, painting that parent as a monster, as horrible, as nothing good. And it's not balanced by anything positive. So that's sort of the essence of bad-mouthing. And I asked the people I interviewed, did you believe it? Did you believe everything mom told you about dad or dad told you about mom? And they said, one young man I interviewed, I said, did you believe everything your mother told you? He said, I believed all of it. She was God. And to children, parents are God, right? It's very scary to entertain the possibility that your parent is lying to you. All right? It's just, it doesn't come naturally to children to question what their parents are telling them.